Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dana Copeland, and I'm going to give the traditional land acknowledgement. We would like to respect the long-standing relationships of the three local First Nations groups of this land and place in southwestern Ontario. The Attawandaron neutral peoples once settled this region alongside the Algonquin and the Haudenosaunee peoples and used this land for their traditional beaver hunting grounds. The three other long-standing Indigenous groups of this geographic region are the Anishinaabe peoples, also referred to as the Three Fires Confederacy, including Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi nations, the Haudenosaunee peoples, also known as the Iroquois people, or Six Nations, including Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and the Lenni Lenape peoples, also referred to as the Delaware or the Munsee. The three First Nations communities closest in proximity to this college are Chippewa the Thames First Nation, which is part of the Anishinaabe, Oneida Nation of the Thames, part of the Haudenosaunee, and Munsee Delaware Nation, part of the Lenni Lenape. Thank you. And I'd like to introduce Sherry Dockstader. Thank you.
Yongo Chimagwet Chanushik. Sugali Sogwe, hello everyone. Diatawone Nyungyats, Hongwe Hoine. They call me traveling woman in my language, call it Sherry Dockstader. Nyungyats, they call me Sherry Dockstader as well. Onya Daaga Ni'i, I'm from Oneida Nation of the Thames, just outside of London here. And Atnoa, Nagitiloro, I belong to the Turtle Clan of that nation as well. So before we get started, and I'm gonna just give you a little welcome to the territory here, and glad to see that you're all here to learn about this stuff today, as well as just give you a little opening or prayer blessing to help us move in a good way and bring our minds together today. Before I do that, I just want to recognize that I brought in the Gaswenta today, or the Turo Wampum. The Turo Wampum is symbolic of a relationship that we have as Haudenosaunee people with the Dutch. It also represents that we have a relationship with non-Indigenous people. So we have Indigenous people that are recognized on this purple line traveling down a river together. And on one side we have Indigenous people, the other side we have non-Indigenous people. And that we will work together in partnership down this path together, this river together, but we also honor that we stay in our own vessels and that we respect that sovereignty with one another. And the white in this represents that we will do that through peace, friendship, and respect. And I bring that to you today in a spirit of reconciliation. I don't like the word reconciliation. I like reconciliation because we're looking at doing action and taking things further. So let's do that together today. So for those of you who want to join me, please do so. I'd like to do a little prayer for us today. I thank the Creator today for allowing us all to come together in a good way with clear minds. Creator, I thank you for all that we are, all that we have, and all our many blessings. Creator, I thank you for all those things that you bring to us, the sun, the moon, the stars, the air we breathe, and the sacred waters that sustain life. Creator, I thank you for Mother Earth, so we have a place to live and grow our food. Creator, we thank you for all living things, those four-legged ones, the winged ones, the sea, the water animals. Creator, we thank you for the plants, the trees, and the flowers, and those sacred medicines that help heal us on Mother Earth. Creator, we thank you for all our loved ones, our family, our friends, and all those that are out there. Creator, we thank you for all their unconditional love and support. We also ask, Creator, for your help and guidance today, and watch over those who are experiencing loss, in pain, sick, sorrow, and lost in this world. Creator, we ask that you watch over those who are journeying home to you, and watch over those families who are going through difficult times at this time. Creator, I ask that you watch over all of those people and all of those who need special guidance today. And in the Creator's name I do pray. Amen. Yongo Chimagwech Inushik Daneto. I'd also like to call upon Jacqueline Smith-Wilson to start off with our presentations. And at the end, after my presentation, if anyone wants to come up and look at the bundle that I brought, you're more than welcome to come up. Yongo Chimagwech Inushik.
Okay, I'm not really used to using a mic, so hopefully I'm not too loud. You can let me know if I get a little bit too loud. I'm not sure if you noticed when you came in, but there was some slides rolling, slides that Amanda Zavitz-Skokam put together just to get you thinking about the topic today. So I'm just going to quickly review those just so you can have an idea of what we're talking about. So today we're talking about the gender wage gap, right? Where we are and certainly where we've been. And that's kind of my role in that, is looking at the history. The gender wage gap is the difference in earnings between women and men in the paid workforce, and that's a really important thing to point out. Gender is only one indicator of how we value work. When we look at the situation from a class or race indicator, we're going to see that the situation is far worse. So why are we looking at gender pay differences or the gender pay gap? I think that the reason is pretty obvious. It's real, it's constant, it's an inequality that still exists in our current labor force, in our history, and in our own backyard, not to mention your future. So we're here today to talk about this gap and the fact that many sources tell us that over a span of a 30-year career, women are making, on average, over $200,000 less. So my question as we start is, can you afford to lose over $200,000? In this presentation, we will be using statistics from Stats Canada, the National Census data collector, as our way to understand the past and the present. I recognize that this is not a perfect system, and I recognize that this certainly gives us more of a working to white middle class kind of picture, at least historically. So these are the three common ways to look at the gender gap, and as you can see, those things look differently depending on the indicators that are used. As Linda, Sherry, and myself will discuss, the wage is not the same for all women. Indigenous women make 65 cents to the dollar, racialized women 67, newcomers to Canada 71 cents, disabled women approximately around 54 cents when compared to a man. So estimates suggest that if we continue in these current trends, it will take 217 years still to close the wage gap, right? And there's varying estimates, but that's just one of them. So essentially, not in your lifetime, right? So this is clearly an issue, a current issue that will affect you at some point. My colleague Linda is going to speak to you about the gap today and why the current system is the way it is, and look at some of the ways that many people are working to improve that so that it doesn't take 217 years. So my job here today is to start with looking at some of the history to the gender wage gap. It's not really that complicated, I don't think, if you understand history and historical trends, but it seems that a lot of people don't, or they don't take the time to look at them. And when we think of women working historically, it's really important to me that we recognize that women have always worked, before colonial history, and certainly afterwards too, and even after industrial capitalism took over. The work was fundamentally important to the labor of society. Our own history shows, as capitalism became the driving force of society, the paycheck became how society valued work, contributions, and by extension, how society valued people. So I want you to think about that as we go through this next 50 minutes. The way that our society values contribution is by the paycheck. As you can imagine, in a Western capitalist patriarchy, which we live in, white, well-to-do men were placed at the very top of that pyramid. Well, I guess not quite the top, right? Money was at the top, but they were there holding it, right? When industrial capitalism took over, especially here in Canada, many women went to work in the factories. Not the middle-class women, not the privileged white women, but the working-class, racialized women and the new arrivals. I guess the easy way to start this journey is to tell you that the gender wage gap has existed since the beginning of industrial capitalism. This is what we call a trend in history, and historical trends are one of the best ways we understand an issue or a current problem. In the shift from an agrarian society or an agricultural-based society to an industrial economy, the white middle class physically separated the worlds of work. The worlds of work and home. The reason for this? Fathers were no longer working alongside the family at the farm or in the family business, but instead they found themselves employed in factories and offices in the city. And out of this was born that historical construction of the Victorian period that looks at the separate spheres, right? The ideology of separate spheres. Men in the public and women in the private. In 10 or so minutes, I cannot possibly cover the history of paid labor in Canada, a progression from the First Peoples through to the service sector reality of today. But what I can give you is a little snapshot of what things have looked like and how even after legislative changes in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 2000s, a lot didn't change. And in some cases, it even got a little bit worse before it got better. One of the things that we're going to look at is the fact that in the 1870s, with the advent of the Second Industrial Revolution that's going to change the way that people live and work, major changes are going to happen for women in North America also. If you were white and middle class, you could likely find work in clerical positions or teaching, more of which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But if you were a member of the lower classes or a visible minority, you could find likely domestic labor jobs or factory work. And these paid much differently than the jobs of white women, white middle-class women, and certainly of men. So where a domestic laborer might have been making $10 or $20 a month, a man at the same time doing similar work in transportation, in the transportation industry, was probably making about $40 a month, just to give you kind of an idea. The inequalities were rampant when you coupled sexism with racism. Many women of color experienced what we call the double jeopardy of being black and a woman or native and a woman, as an example. Domestic service was the single most important paid employment for women and the lowest paid at the turn of the century. In 1891, 41% of women considered to be working for pay were domestic servants. In 1871, women and children constituted 42% of the industrial workforce in Montreal, and I use Montreal specifically because of the example I'm going to use. In 1889, a very exhausted young woman who was working as an apprentice in a cigar manufacturing company, her name was Georgiana Lucelle, she said she was too exhausted to make one more cigar that day. And her manager said, no, you need to make 100 more, and if you don't, I will spank you. That was her threat of punishment. She said, I'm sorry, I cannot make another one. So what ended up happening is she gets thrown to the floor, she gets pinned there, and she gets spanked with a cigar mold in front of all of her peers. This is one of the realities of what work was like in 1889 for women. In fact, most female workers barely made a living wage at all at the turn of the century. In 1889, the Ontario Bureau of Industries provided a cost of living analysis for women workers without dependents. Average annual earnings was calculated to be around $216, where living expenses was just over $214. So she could save at most $2.43 a year, which means women who had dependents faced a deficit in a year of over $14. Another new area for work for mainly white women and white women with education emerged in the clerical and retail sectors. Clerical work in the 1800s was considered men's work. It was valued and it was well paid. Often it was situated as a way to learn the business in order to take it over or go out on your own. In 1901, only 1 in 20 women were working in the clerical field, which was about a fifth of all clerical workers, and it was still paid fairly well. 10 years later, 1 in 10 women were in clerical work, which was about a third of all clerical workers. Today, women dominate the field, and it is no longer valued as one of the most successful professions with the paycheck attached to it. Clerical work was seen as clean, white-collar work for middle-class white women. And when the typewriter was introduced, it made women have a whole new access to a whole new career, right? Women did not replace male clerical workers as much as they filled a need for a new type of clerical worker. So men still continued to be apprentices and taking over those businesses, but they left the clerical work for the women. So answering the phones, doing the filing systems, those kinds of things, the customer service. This is mirrored on the shop floors, where men used to be the ones who ran the storefronts. Women start taking it over, as many white middle-class women were the purchasers, right? So they were seen as better fit for that. They were called shop girls, and they were paid substantially less as well. Now, I don't have time to get into everything, but the World Wars is really important to women's rights, from getting the right to vote to certainly the right to access to paid labor. I teach a whole course on this, so I don't think I can do it justice in a couple of minutes. But one of the things I want you to think about, that it's not until the 20th century that women are really going to see changes in their rights, at least legislatively, okay? And it's those changes that women are going to get really excited about, but then the realities are we're not going to see the progression, certainly not at the speed many people would have liked to have seen. Okay. One of the things that women did prove, though, during the Second World War is that they could do the work, right? That not only could they do it, but they could do it better in some cases. Production rates were increasing, and certainly the way in which jobs were being handled were improving also. One of the areas that I just want to look at pretty quickly that women found some comfort in was working as a teacher. And they often found better pay in this as well. Teaching was considered one of the best paid professions for women at the turn of the century. Okay. So by the last few decades of the 19th century, the occupation that engaged the most women after domestic service, and yes, there's a class and race indicator here, was teaching. When teaching was a male-dominated field, it was considered a professional career, and it was paid as such. But as women moved into the profession, the status of teaching became really ambiguous. By 1901, women dominated the profession. 75% of women were teachers. By 1920, 75% of teachers were women. By 1920, 83% of elementary school teachers were women, and as you went up the higher levels of the educational ladder, you started to see fewer and fewer female teachers due to educational barriers of the time, right? But nationwide in 1901, women teachers were earning on average about $246 annually, well above the average for domestic service, which was about $137. In 1901, male teachers, on the other hand, were making about $486 on average, almost half more. They were making more than the average male wage earners as well, who were making about $387 a year. But there was a considerable gap between male teachers and the men in the professional category, the category that men used to be part of in the 1870s when they were making $600+. So the professional category would have been government workers, would have been engineers, doctors, lawyers. They were making between around $677 on average a year. That's where teachers used to be, and now they're at $486. Why is that? Well, the big change is that women came into the profession en masse, 75% by 1901. Wages decrease as professions became feminized. Certainly, regionalism mattered too. This chart is from 1931 and 1941. It's from Stats Canada, and it's comparing teachers' salaries from this time period. A male teacher in Prince Edward Island was making more than a female teacher in Prince Edward Island, but he was making less than a female teacher in BC. So these kinds of things will really affect the statistics we're looking at. It's not surprising that some of the biggest gaps are in Quebec, where a lot of their legislative changes for women lagged behind the rest of the country as well. In PEI in Quebec, one of the interesting things is over 10 years, you can see that men's wages actually go up, while women's wages actually go down. And they don't go up much. You can see in PEI, they went from $683 to $691, where a woman went from $515 to $444. This is yet another reason why statistics aren't perfect, but they're one piece. Okay. So So many people may be asking, well, what about today? What about women today that have made it to the top of the teaching profession? Because they're there. We see female professors, right? Stats Canada figures show to us that the University of Toronto paid male and female professors a difference of about $23,275 a year, a difference of 14%. Over a 30-year career for female professors, that means almost $700,000 in lost income. The University of Toronto is not alone. When we look at the Big 15 research-intensive universities, we see that it is no better. We see the gap is around 11%. And no, men are not better researchers, and no, they are not bringing in more grant money. Those are myths that get entrenched in the language of patriarchy. Those are what I tell my kids are make-believe excuses. So the gender pay gap is not a new problem, right? We see that women have made it into these professions to the top, and yet they still make thousands less a year. It's really time that men and women are valued equally, and that gets reflected by their paycheck, the value our society places on work. I don't have time to get into all of the legislation. My time is actually up, but if you want to talk about this further, I would be more than happy to show you how all of the legislative changes in Ontario and Canada haven't mimicked equality in the paycheck. So that's one slide. There's another slide that just gives you a few statistics on where the gender pay gap actually was, and the fact that sometimes that pay gap got worse before it got better again, as some of those statistics can show. I was going to talk to you about how historically men and women's jobs, it was really easy to find out the jobs that you were qualified for because they were advertised as such, right? We're looking for men to do this job and women to do that job, right? The newspapers had whole sections devoted to men's work and women's work. It was really easy to see it, right? In the 1950s, lots of women became Girl Fridays, secretaries, right? Where the second thing listed there is that she must be attractive, right? Today, they may not advertise these jobs as women's jobs and men's jobs, but the statistics tell us that there is women's work and there is men's work. And the statistics tell us how extreme those numbers are. And then when you look at the way that we value those jobs by a paycheck, it again shows you the extremes of that. So I'm hoping at this point, nobody is questioning that the gender wage gap exists or that it's a problem, as I hand things over to Linda, and she's going to talk to us about that a little bit further.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Amanda for arranging this talk today, and thank you, Jacqueline, for the introduction. So we have recently, just on March the 8th, celebrated International Women's Day. And on April the 9th, we're going to be, not celebrating, but in Ontario at least, we'll be recognizing the Equal Pay Day. So Equal Pay Day is the day that women have finally earned what men had earned the previous year. So we finally get caught up, and it falls around April the 9th. Obviously, it's a calculation, and in Ontario, that calculation comes to early April, so April 9th will be the day. And so that's speaking about a 26% wage gap, and I just kind of like to take a poll right now. How many people in the room are surprised that there's a gap and that it's 26%? Just let me know. Oh, everybody see a couple people? Okay. Because when I talk to people, I do get that surprise. There's still a gap. We have pay equity legislation in Ontario and have had, you saw on Amanda's slide, since for 30 years now. Why is there still a gap? Because it's illegal, right? So we're going to talk about some things in my part of the talk here about not just the equal pay for equal work, but some extensions of that piece. So I've just returned from the United Nations in New York, where member countries are negotiating a document that'll govern the country's action towards equality for women and girls in the coming year. This document should be signed actually today. Today is the ending of the CSW 63. It'll come to a close. And they do this every single year. So every year this document is negotiated and signed by all the member countries, and then those countries work towards equality for women in their countries. And it involves closing the gender wage gap. It involves violence against women, ending child marriages, and a whole host of other things. So, my name's Linda Davis. I've spent the past 25 years working for equality and balance between the men and women. I engaged in this activism through an organization called Business and Professional Women, where I'm currently the national president. I also sit on the boards of the Provincial Council of Women, the Canadian Federation of University Women, and other groups as well. And these groups are engaged in creating a society where men and women are treated equally. And it's a way any person, especially everyone here today, can become a change maker. So I'm wearing my change maker shirt. So, in 2015-16, I was appointed by an order in council to the steering committee to close the gender wage gap by the Ontario Minister of Labour. So during that time, we researched a variety of issues, jurisdictions, all kinds of things. Then we came up with our consultation paper, and we posted that for everyone to be able to contribute to. And then we visited 15 cities, where in those cities, we talked to city officials, employers, and the public. We read hundreds of submissions, and then we submitted a 70-page final report and recommendations to the government. So I've got it here. This is available on the Ministry of Labour website, the Ontario Minister of Labour. It's still there, and there are 20 recommendations in here. The research document is here as well, so if you ever have to do any work and research, we've done it for you already, and it's there for you to grab, as well as those recommendations. So unfortunately, those recommendations were starting to get implemented at the time the government changed hands, so things have changed now. So, some of the things that came out of this, though, I won't go into detail if you want to read the document. Pay transparency is one of the things that's being discussed right now, so the current government is now looking at the pay transparency that was supposed to be implemented, and they're saying, should we do this? Let's talk to employers. Do you really want this? So I would say to you, everyone in this room, please go onto the website. Please let your voice be heard and say, yes, we need pay transparency. So the reason that we need pay transparency is we can't ever hope to close the gender wage gap if we have no clue what anybody's making. We have a very secretive society, I guess. How many people in this room know what your parents make? How many parents know what you guys make? Do you know what your siblings make? You know, that kind of thing. So it's not a topic of conversation at the dinner table, and it should be. Because when you're going in to negotiate your wage, you should have an idea of what kinds of incomes you should expect and what kinds of incomes historically people have been earning. So we'll be submitting to the government for sure on this transparency issue, and I hope that all of you do as well. So one of the other key pieces that's keeping us from reaching our closing this gender wage gap are the sharing the care with the family. So if men are not encouraged to take their turn to leave work and care for their children, women will continue to be penalized by taking large amounts of time away from work, being overlooked for advancements, and not accepting full-time work or challenging positions even, because of the need to be flexible for that family care. Men are also being penalized by not having the time to bond with their own children. And so we need to work towards that balance of care. And this is going to benefit the children as well. So it's a win-win-win situation. That's a change in the way we do things within our society. And the governments have provided those leaves for men and for women. And we as people now need to engage in that and step up and take our fair share. Because what it means for women to take, and I don't think a lot of women think about this. My daughter certainly didn't when she said, I want to take the full year off with my baby. But what is that doing to your pension? You're getting a very reduced part of your income, and you're not contributing to your pension usually during that time. So like a work pension. So those are the kinds of things that we need to sort of think ahead and think, well, not only am I being selfish by not letting my husband have that bonding time with the children, we need to just open that up and make sure that we're sharing that. The other area of concern is the low female-dominated workplaces that Jackie had mentioned. So this hurts everyone, and it's not realistic. So I'm going to give you a little example here. We have a cable installer, and that's a 97% male-dominated career. This cable installer, and I'll say him, he is going to work for 2 years of training. In that 2 years of training, he'll earn $35,000 a year, so it's kind of a reduced income. Then we compare that to a practical nurse, and that's a 95% dominated female job. And she's going to go to school for 2 years, and she's going to learn her education, and it's going to cost her probably $5,000 a year tuition, and so then that's for a 2-year period. When the training ends for the cable installer, he's going to earn $65,000 a year because he's put in his time. The practical nurse is going to walk out the door and start earning $35,000 a year, so she's already starting at half of his income. And she's also probably going to have a student debt of about $10,000. And that's being very conservative. The reality is, do we as a people actually value that cable installer and the job and the work that he does more than we do a practical nurse? Do we think that he actually has skills beyond what she might have? These are kinds of questions we need to ask ourselves when we're comparing jobs that are totally unrelated, but still require a degree of effort and skill and knowledge to be able to execute them. And we have to say, is it really something that do we value the things in our lives that men tend to take care of, the equipment, those kinds of things, or do we value the people in our lives, and we find women often taking care of the people in our lives? And I would challenge that it's really more about valuing the woman herself. And our society has slipped into a place where we just don't value women. And if you consider it that way, women are a pool of cheap labor. And we don't value them as much as men. And that leads to a whole bunch of other issues that find their root cause in social problems. If we're not valuing women as much as we value men, and we're coming from a patriarchal society, as Jackie mentioned, and so that's part of what we have to fight against in our unconscious and conscious biases. So everyone in our society is guilty of this bias because women and men are all raised the same in this patriarchal environment. Women often believe that they're not worthy, or they don't deserve it, or they're reluctant to step up. Men actually overvalue themselves when we look at the research, and they will ask for more money because they think that they're more valuable. Women will ask for less, often thinking they're less valuable. And so we need to work on both groups. One of the ways we can do this is there's a program through the UN Women called He for She, where men can start to look at what they might be doing to contribute to this problem, unconsciously probably, but it's ways that they can work towards starting to value women as equals. And I believe that we actually need a She for She campaign, because I think women also need to learn how we undervalue ourselves and each other, and how we need to re-look at those issues and start to value more. One of the ways that government has tried to correct the problem is by pushing more women into male-dominated jobs. The problems with that aspect is they don't supply the supports after. We've heard from countless women who've gone into male-dominated jobs who have not been supported after the fact and have dropped out of those jobs because of discrimination and an employer and employment situation that's not conducive to her success. And so we need to relook at that and say if we are going to train women in male-dominated jobs, we have to make sure that we put in some safeguards for success after the fact. And it's not necessarily going to fix the problem, as Jacqueline mentioned before. We've seen countless careers that have gone from high-paying to low-paying simply because now they're flooded with females. And when women come into a job, we see that the wages drop. And so that tells you it's not the job that's being valued, and that's about as hardcore evidence as I can find. Human resources professional was a male-dominated career. It was extremely high-paying. And now it is a female-dominated career, and the wages have fallen. And so when we look at that, we have to admit something else is happening here. This is bias, and this is discrimination, and we have to make sure that it stops. So negotiating wages is another one that often you'll hear. If women would just negotiate, they would be better off. But then there's a backlash, and we see that in the literature as well, that when women negotiate a wage, they're often viewed as all kinds of negative things that I can't say here. But pushy is kind of the only one that I can say that's for mixed company. But so there is a backlash to that. And again, that's the bias that's happening. So I just want to kind of wrap up here and say that I do believe that we can eliminate the gap, the wage gap, and create a truly egalitarian society by balancing every level of every workplace, balancing family care, and valuing all women and men equally. I would also like to add that we are going to have some awareness happening next week. So even though Equal Pay Day is not till April the 9th, we are going to launch awareness here at Fanshawe. We do have buy-in from the top. So President Devlin has said he respects this and wants to see it happen. So on the 27th and 28th, we'll have some tables set up in the hallway. Some of the vendors here at Fanshawe are offering 26% discount for women, and that's to help offset this gender wage gap, and rightly so. So please, have a look at that. Drop by our table, pick up your coupon, and there's also going to be a workshop about how to negotiate wages in a productive way, or find out what the wages should be when you go out to the workplace. So I will say no more about that, and I'll turn this now over to Sherry. Thank you.
Siguli again. Thank you for that, and thank you for both your presentations and giving us that background. I come today to bring a perspective as an Indigenous person, Indigenous woman, and really trying to, I guess, create a dialogue about some of what you've heard about the gap in wage. So I come from personal experience, and that's what I'm going to speak to you about today. The one thing that we talked to, or you heard the presenters talk about, is this sense of value. And do we put value in the sense of work, but also do we put the value in all human people and into the human race? And is that different for men, women, or whatever gender that you identify with? So for me, the way we were raised and in our culture, I come from a matrilineal society. So it was very female-driven, female-dominant, and that sense of recognition of equity, not equality, but equity was there. So that if you were struggling and you needed help, and it wasn't identified necessarily that this was a male role, but this role, this gap needed to be filled. So whether you were male, female, whatever gender you identify as, you stepped in. If you could provide that help and that support, you would go ahead and do that. Over time, some of you in this room may understand what the true history is for Indigenous people in Canada in with regards to residential school and assimilation policies around 60s scoop, and even what's going on today in child welfare, where our children are still being stolen today. So looking at all of that and understanding that the strong history and historical ancestral bloodline that I carry is still alive and well in my community. I grew up on settlement. We don't refer to ourselves as a reserve. It's actually a settlement outside London here. Is that I carry that forward in a good way, in a strong way for those generations that come behind me. But I'm also dealing with everything you heard today is a woman, is an Indigenous person. I'm not young anymore, but when I was young as well, I had to deal with those things. So coming from that perspective, a lot of times I was the only female in the room in a business meeting. A lot of times I was the only Indigenous person in the room in business meetings. And a lot of times I was the only young person in the room in business meetings. So it was very challenging, to say the least. And had I not been raised by strong women, that may have provided me to, that may have been a setback for me. And I may have stepped out of those roles. And I may have said, you know what, this isn't for me, and I'm not going to do this anymore. I don't know what that would have done. The role models in my life come through the ancestral lines of my female line. So my grandmothers, my aunties, my mom, my sisters, all my female cousins who are my sisters, that strength that we have, it's not to say that we don't respect the men or disregard the men in any way. It's not to say that at all. In fact, the fact that we have such strong women in our family, it means that when the men need our help and our support, we can reach out to one another and provide that help and support to one another. One thing that I do want to identify as well is that historically speaking, our Indigenous people were paid less. So my grandfather, he's no longer with us, he's passed on. He is my Luxot, as we refer to him. He was a veteran of World War II. And he returned from the war, as many veterans did, with a sense of accomplishment and giving back in patriotism, and had a sense of connection to this country that we call Canada, and that he had some expectation for some remuneration in that regard. So he got a house built on our settlement because he received some remuneration and could build that home. But it was probably less than half of what any other veteran would have received in Canada at that time, for the mere fact that he was Indigenous. So those are the types of things that our men had to deal with, never mind that our women were never recognized. Sometimes even, I know that I can't remember the exact date, but we didn't have even the right to vote, for example, in Canada. So those are some of the historical things that you can take a look at. One thing I do want to talk about is that domestic work, that my grandmother did a lot of that domestic work as well in the 50s and 60s into early 70s. In the 70s, because I was a young child at that time, she became my role model because I was with my grandmother a lot, and she started to establish small business and entrepreneurship. My grandfather, who was a mechanic, opened his own garage. He's a very good mechanic, knew how to do his job, did not know how to run a business. It took my grandmother to do the books, handle all the customer service, handle getting those bills paid, and making sure that not only was her household running, but also that their business was running in an efficient manner. So she's the one that taught me that. The other thing I want to mention is that money isn't everything. I showed you the Gaswenta just a little while ago, the wampum here. The wampum belts were used sometimes as currency, and we would exchange that for goods and services. We also exchanged other things. If I had corn and you had beans, then we would exchange that. We had the bartering system. So our people traditionally have always had food on the table. We could always provide for our families. We always had roofs over our head because we knew how to deal in this barter system. And that's something that's still alive and well today. What do you measure success? Is that something that you look at how much money I have in the bank? When you ask most Indigenous people who've grown up on reserve or on settlement, like I have, the measure of success is not what you have in the bank or what you leave behind you. It's what the investment you've put into your family, your community, and holistically, we talk about clans in our community. So I belong to the Turtle Clan. Is a clan family. What are you giving back to your clan family as well? So it isn't just about your immediate family, your brothers, your sister, your mom and dad. You have a connection everywhere, and you have a responsibility, and you have a role to fulfill throughout your life. For those children who were taken from us and were not able to grow up in that environment, they feel that. They're missing that. They feel a lack of self-identity, and they don't know where they belong, and some of them struggle. So you start to see what's happening is that our women, Indigenous women, will not fight for what they believe is right for them. And I know there's a lot of women out there who are like that. Sometimes the fight is just not worth it. The other thing I want to mention is that growing up on reserve, a lot of the breadwinners in our communities on reserve and on settlement are women. You look at our families, the women are the ones that are bringing home the money. So where do they work? They work in nonprofits that don't pay a lot. And if they are working in a nonprofit and have male counterparts, those male counterparts are getting paid more money. And if they are Indigenous, they're usually getting paid less as well. What we find is that the women that will do those jobs get paid because that's the only job they could find. They'll stay in those roles for 20, 30, 40 years sometimes, not realizing that they could go back to school and earn their degrees, get their education, get their diplomas to actually increase their salary wages. Instead, they'll take on the work of their male counterparts, so their male counterparts can go back to school and get the training. And they take on those roles. They'll even train those men. I know that some of you may be too young to remember this, but there was a movie out in the 80s called 9 to 5. It starred Jane Fonda, Dolly Parton, Lily Tomlin. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it. It's really talking about what we're talking about today, about what is fair, what is equity, and how do we do that job, and how do we get our strength back as women and have our voice heard. We can't do that individually. We have to do it together, united, not only as women, but men have a role in that, because we have to support each other through this as well. So I just want to wrap up with saying that, my experience, personal experience has been that I have always stepped up to the plate and not only fought for my position to be at that boardroom table or be in other positions and fought for my salary, my income, but I will do that for anybody else that I see that is not willing to do that as well. I've done it for women that I've worked for. The saddest thing I've seen, and I've seen this over the last 5-6 years, is when a woman steps into a role and says, yes, I'm willing to take a pay cut. That's the saddest thing I have ever seen, and I've seen Indigenous women do that because they want to give back so much and say, I'm willing to do this job. Yes, I can take a pay cut. That's okay. I'll do that. And I will go and talk to those women and say, please, please do not ever accept a pay cut. Know your value, know you have a voice, and know you will be heard. With that, I want to say thank you. Go Chimagwetchanushik.
Thanks, Sherry. At this point, we'll open it up to questions, if there's any questions from anyone. Yes.
If I sat down and was in an interview, let's say anywhere, and I had the same credentials as him, and we went to school at the same time, did everything. If we both sat down and had an interview, would they actually say he's going to make more and I'm going to make less?
Well, they would be really not very bright if they said that out loud. Because when they actually say it or put it in writing or those kinds of things, those are ways in which you can actually do something about it. Linda, do you want to just talk about
Is
that?
it actually just blind and I don't see it and I'm not understanding because it's not there?
So we had a woman come in and speak to us, a high-ranking law firm, and she had a woman come in and hired the woman and told her what they would pay, and the woman accepted it and was all just very happy She interviewed the man right afterwards, and the man said, when they offered him the job, he said, well, I would require, and he named his price. And they said, absolutely. And she came to our talk, oh, thank you. She came to our talk and said, we would have gladly paid the woman more, but she didn't ask. So, yeah, the answer is yes, likely you will end up with less money. That's what statistics show.
You want to go to one of these sessions next week, because that's what they'll be talking about, the career services sessions?
Yeah, so Career Services has got two sessions running, one on Wednesday, one on Thursday, called 26 Tips to Close the Gender Wage Gap, and it's 2:30 to 3:30. So you can register for it on their link, and I think they'll be talking about exactly that. Thanks.
And I think you brought up a good point too, that it's not the woman's fault that she didn't ask or negotiate, right? That is what we call a trend, a societal trend, right? And certainly a social construct with how men and women should value themselves and ask or not ask for those kinds of things, right? Which is really important as well. Go ahead.
I was just wondering what organization sponsored this event.
No. There was no organization that sponsored the event. I organized something called the Social Science Speaker Series, and that's something that I do personally, and that's the venue for this event. Any other questions?
I really don't have a question, but I would like to say, as she was saying, when a man or a woman or a boy or a girl, they're fresh graduate, they will start, even if they start at the same pay, over the career, like in 10 years or 20 years, you will see women fall behind because they take time off when they start family to take care of kids, and sometimes they don't actually take promotion even if they deserve, and they will fall behind. Like over the year, 20 years, 30 years, you will see that women are behind.
That's a great point. I was traveling to Toronto for a lot of these meetings that I had to go to, and I met a woman on the train. Sounds like a joke, right? And so we got talking about what I was doing, and she said, you know, now that you mention it, I started my career and I earned more than my husband. Then I took time off. We have 3 children. And she said, over the course of the last 8 years, I have still not returned to full-time work. He's gone way past where I was, and I could never, ever hope to catch his wage now. So that's a real-life example.
About the negotiations, I was just reading an article about this morning. It was really interesting because they talked about the agreeableness as a trait in religious negotiation. And the study, I just need to quote this because it blew my mind. While men earned a premium for being quote-unquote disagreeable and negotiating more, the attribute was not found to be related to women's wages because the gender difference in agreeableness only rewarded men, but women who scored lower on agreeableness and were comparable to men did not receive the reward on a regression analysis. So it's not about the trait, it's about the social mediation of that trait, that women who do negotiate, it's not as easy as saying, I need that salary. It's also hard that we just, as somebody pointed out, we don't receive that same negotiation or that same, I keep using disagreeables as a big 5 personality trait that sometimes people use to say, oh, it's not about gender, it's about personality or something like that, but it absolutely is about gender because we don't receive the exact same trait of personalities, won't be received the same way. I can give you the citation, I'm just blown away.
It's a plus for him and a minus for her.
Right, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And if I can just elaborate that one step further, I had a professor come in from Western to speak. He's an economics professor, to speak in one of the panels I put on. And he said that when he put out his, and he was a tough guy. If you didn't get your stuff in on time, you weren't getting marked. And he had a female counterpart who was teaching economics, and she was pretty tough too. Anyway, they got their feedback back from the students, and he was being thanked for being tough because it kicked their butts and made them do what they needed to do. She had all kinds of negative comments about her personality and what a witch she was, and witch wasn't the word, but you know what I mean, because of her doing the exact same thing. They swapped paperwork, and he said, he came to my session and he didn't talk about economics, he talked about this. He said, I was shocked to see that she was being disrespected for this exact same thing that I do. So just your point, I think, in spades. Any other questions? Yeah, back.
Hi, thank you for the talk, everybody. Can you just, for the sake of me not being originally from Canada, can you guys elaborate a little bit more on existing or likely future legislation that could actually enforce transparency in terms of the outcome of employees? And also, if you can talk a little bit about how easy or difficult or how ideal it would be for such a legislation to be passed on either for private business and for public or private as well. Because I understand that there's some difficulties to do that in the private sector.
Right.
For public employees, like you said, that would be easier.
Mhm.
And the reason for my question is I do believe that better transparency is probably one of the best tools that we can use in order to reinforce wage.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question about wage transparency, if anybody did not hear. So the United Kingdom is a great example because for 5 years they put in place a voluntary process for employers to disclose their wage, so that wage transparency piece. And they had less than a 5% uptake in 5 years. So they said, scrap that, we're going to mandatory. And they've now moved to a mandatory process where employers are now required to comply with that. And it's working fine. It's not a horrendous thing for employers. In a lot of wage transparency situations, it's information they're gathering for income tax anyway, and stuff they have to disclose that area. So it's not a lot of extra work, and it's something that I agree with you when you say that we can't move forward without it. When I was at the United Nations, I went to a session from the German government talking about what they do, and wage transparency was discussed. One of the people in the audience said, you can take it a step farther and going to the private sector piece that you're talking about. A lot of governments have investments in the private sector, and they own shares in companies that are private sector companies. And through that, they can force disclosure because they own shares. And so as a shareholder, they can request that information. And I think the Canadian government could look at that as well. So I hope that answers your question. Anybody else want to?
Well, I think, I don't know if I need this. I think that with historically every time we get legislation, unfortunately, the reality is unless someone is going to enforce it, check up on it, make sure that there is transparency with it, it just doesn't happen. The same with the civil rights legislation in America, right? All of these things we can see historically didn't end up happening the way they were intended, because once they got put in place, people were like, well, I don't really care about it. I'm not going to check up on it. I'm not going to make sure. So the Transparency Act is really important, and Ontario's kind of leading the way there in Canada. But whether or not this actually ends up becoming something that is improving the gap, I guess we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen with this current government. And that's the thing, when governments change, so do policies, so do progressive pieces of legislation, right? Sometimes they get put on the back burner, which is unfortunately what we might be seeing, but...
It's in front of the federal government right now.
Yeah, yeah. So do what Linda said, right? Go online, sign the paperwork, right? Challenge it. Tell them that this is important to you. That's one way that you can absolutely use your voice to be heard and to try and make these issues certainly important to your government as well, right? Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you taking the time to attend this important event, and I want to again say thank you so much to Sherry and to Linda and Jacqueline for taking time to come to present to us on such an important topic. I hope you're able to join with us next week. It's in the F hallway on Wednesday and Thursday, and you can chat more about this issue. I believe it's an all-day event if that's something that you're interested in attending. So thank you again for your participation.